Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the procedural city generator. In this short video, I'm going to show you guys how to add your own sidewalks to your city. It's going to be fairly simple. All we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to actually create the sidewalk islands and how to make the manual adjustments that you need to do to make sure that it looks the way you want it to look. So if I go ahead and jump into Unreal, I've already created a little city here. You can see that we have just some of the main roads here. It doesn't really matter. I just wanted to have just certain amount of roads here, because the concept is that the sidewalks, instead of being connected to the road themselves, they're going to be procedural meshes that generate between the roads. That way you can have any shape you want, or at least that's the theory. So before we get started, the very first thing I want to mention is, you'll see this sometimes. I just opened the level and I had my PCG main widget open, but sometimes you'll see this when you open the level, no city is detected. You see that there's nothing here for whatever reason. So you can either close this and open it again and it'll automatically search for it, or you can click on current city, even though it doesn't look it is an actual button. See how I'm pressing it, and it'll automatically run the search for cities in your map. So that's one thing to note. You can click on current city and refresh the list here in case you don't see that. All right, so let me just explain to you a little bit of kind of the goal of how I'm generating the sidewalks and some of the big challenges that I have. The first thing is that because of the way I'm generating the rows, these are splines, and my algorithms are fairly freeform, you can get all kinds of different shapes, right? If I go back to roads, for example, and I remove the main roads and I generate them again, you can see that we can get all kinds of different shapes. So there is no set way for me to know the exact shape that you'll need in between the roads. So that's one of the challenges. Because I want to keep it as a spline to give you guys flexibility, it's very difficult to know how to produce a efficient mesh that's going to generate the sidewalks. So my method was to basically have a blueprint that it'll sit in between roads. It'll basically scan the shape, try it as best it can to trace for the shape, and then use the procedural mesh to generate that custom shape. And that's going to be your sidewalk. However, there are many challenges with that. First of all, how do you detect the centroid of a shape? If it's fairly rectangular like this, is very simple, right? You'll put it right here, but there are all kinds of shape, like for example this shape, which is a little bit more complicated to find automatically. I'm talking about programmatically. The centroid here and trace these shapes, at least in Blueprint, is very hard. So that's one challenge. Then another challenge is, where do you put the islands? Do you want islands everywhere? Do you want them by zone? Right? Typically you want sidewalks maybe on the city center, but if you have like a more rural area, you may not want sidewalks. So that's another challenge. What if the sidewalks island goes in between zones? How do I detect that? Do I stop the island in between, right? So there's challenges there. And then is the generation code itself, which I need to make it more efficient. So this is the reason why this feature is experimental. Right? So I'm going to show you how to do it. Feel free to use it, but please keep in mind that this is very rough and experimental. I used to have a menu and it's still there, but I specifically made it invisible when you open it here. It used to be here, sidewalks, just because I want to make sure that you guys are making a conscious effort that you're going to use this, that it's not going to be like a regular thing, because it's not polished at all. So with all that said, I know a lot of warnings. It's actually very simple to do. Go to the blueprints folder, go to sidewalks, and there's going to be a blueprint called BP Sidewalk Island. All you need to do, you need to grab it and you'll drop it somewhere. Let's just pick a random shape. Let's just do this one here. You grab it and you drop it here. And obviously, because it is manual, you try to put it kind of in the middle of the shape. And then as you have it selected, you'll see that we have a few options here under the setup and setup generation. So the first thing before we look at any settings is we go all the way down to the blue utilities here, and they're numbered. We're going to use only button 1, 2, and 3. So number 1 is trace the shape location. You press the number 1 button, and notice how we're basically drawing a spline. These are spline points, tracing the shape as best as you can. See here in this case, for example, it didn't quite detect the corner there, and here it didn't quite detect this corner because it's tracing literally line traces from here. So you can see here that it wasn't able to detect that. Obviously, these are too many points, so then we want to simplify the shape, and that's number 2. And you can see that now I have some code there that tries to go and simplify the amount of spline points. And then finally you click on generate island, and you see that we have a shape. And right now you have this transparent material so you can see through it, and that's what I call the construction mode. If you go here on setup and you disable construction mode, same as the roads, then you'll have a different material applied, and this is the surface material that you have here and the side material, and it looks more like concrete, so you can see here, right? But for our sake, to make things a little bit easier, let's go back to construction mode and let's try to match the shape. So it's very simple. These are spline points. All you need to do is just move the spline points to match the shape. Make my camera a little bit faster here. And typically you're going to have difficulties with the corners, so you'll have to adjust the corners. And you see that as you're adjusting the corners, the shape is being created. For example, this spline point here is probably not needed. You can actually just delete it if you wanted to. And you're going to kind of look around and see if you're getting the shape. Same thing here. These two corners need to be adjusted. So you can just kind of do it like this. And this guy, you kind of move it like here. All right. And I'm not going to spend too much time here. You can see that in this case, because the road is concave here, you could technically click here, add a spline point, and then kind of move this guy here. So obviously you can spend time, when you're doing this for real, spend time to try to really get the shape going as much as you want. And then when you're finally happy with it, you can go out of construction mode, and you see that now we have a sidewalk. And if I click on play here, you'll see that even though when you're creating it doesn't really look like much, the default, you can see that it has this height. Is very subtle, but depending on which country you're in, the sidewalks may or may not be this high. You can play with some of the settings here. Obviously, you can change the materials. So actually, before we do that, let's go to the generation tab and look at the height value. This is perhaps the most important one. By default, it's 50 units. You can make this whatever you want. 200 units, right? Like a massive, massive sidewalk island. Probably a little too high, right? But you get the point. You can play around with the height. And then some of these other things are related to the actual generation. There are two methods of creating the sidewalk. There's a generation that is spline points, and that is the default. That is the most low poly one. It's just going to use the actual points here. Or you can use subdivisions, and that'll smooth out the shape. You can see there. But depending on what shape you have, I would recommend to play around with these settings. The more subdivisions, polygon subdivisions, the smoother the shape will be. But again, I would recommend keeping it in spline points. And just to illustrate the point a little bit more, let me show you what I mean. So if I just drop this guy here and I'm selecting the spline points here, as I am creating the shape, in this case manually, notice the spline is curved, but the shape is obviously very polygonal, right? Because I'm using the spline point generation. If I change this to subdivision, notice that it smooths it out. Because it's not using the points, but it's using the distance of the spline, and it's subdividing it, in this case by 32. But if you look at the amount of polygonal detail, this is subdivided. Look at all these triangles here versus spline point. Very, very different. So again, I would suggest keeping spline points, but if you need to have it a lot smoother, go ahead and use subdivisions. All right. And that's, guys, that's pretty much it. Obviously, you can change the material. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff, but you can change the material. Obviously, the surface material is the one at the top and the bottom, and then the side material is, of course, what you see on the sides here. So in the case that you wanted to have something different, let me just make it obvious here. Like the side of the sidewalk will be another material. You can just literally select anything else, and it'll just apply that material to the side. And that's pretty much it. And then once you have your sidewalk, you would do this after you generate the roads. Eventually you go to the buildings, and then you can just spawn your buildings. And that's it. And as you can see, we have buildings that have spawned on top of the sidewalk, just like you would expect. These are just regular buildings. And that's it. Very, very simple. But like I said, this is quite experimental. So use it if you really need to. But again, please keep in mind that it's quite rough. One last thing I want to show is because I was getting some questions on Discord about the building blueprint. This zone that I'm using here is the simple buildings zone. And if I open the simple building zone, you guys can notice that here on the building details, the actor class is a completely custom blueprint. It is not my default building based blueprint, but instead is something completely different that as the building spawns, it'll randomly vary the height and the material of the building. So you're not limited to using my class. Notice that if I click on the drop down, I can literally select anything I want. The only thing that the spawner cares about is the bounds. This is what it's going to use to do the trace, and then the buffer between the other buildings and the road buffer. The blueprint itself is quite irrelevant to the spawner. It doesn't care what it is. I still suggest you use my base class because it has a lot of optimizations on it. But if you have something else, like if you have a procedural building that you want to spawn, you can absolutely do that. And just to show you that this is an actual blueprint and it is live, you can see that I have some things here. I can do randomized material. You see I'm clicking on the utility here. And I can either randomize floors, as you can see, and this utility, this function, is triggered at spawn point via an interface. So every time even though this is a very simple material, that blueprint is automatically randomly selecting a height every single time a building spawns. So that's just kind of a little aside to show you guys that it is possible to spawn anything. I know there are several procedural building blueprints in the marketplace. If you want to use those with Procedural City Generator, you absolutely can. All you need to do is just add the blueprint right here on the actor reference for your building. Make sure you add the correct bounds and details, and everything should spawn. All right, guys. That is pretty much it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave your comments down below in the video. Otherwise, come in, join our Discord, and talk to us. Give me your feedback. I really want to know what you think. If you have any other requests for tutorials, again, these are coming out a little bit slower because I don't have as much time nowadays, but I'll try to address your questions. I've seen so many questions about sidewalks. This is why I did this tutorial. And I saw some chatter about using your custom blueprints as buildings, which is why I'm showing you guys this here. I have other tutorials planned for the future, things like how to use the level streaming system and how to go more in depth into some of the settings for spawning the buildings and the roads, etc. So more tutorials coming. In the meantime, feel free to ask your questions in the comments below. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you in the next video.